What I wanted to do here today, when we get started, I wanted to introduce our presenters today, and we're so very happy that Dr. Pam Thurman and Dr. Barbara Plested are able to join us today. They're both creators of the Community Readiness Model, so we're very lucky to have them today to share their knowledge, their wisdom, and share some examples with us. And so we encourage all of your questions for them, and we look forward to their presentation. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Thurman and Dr. Plested.
Thank you, Courtney. We are very pleased to be able to present this information today. My name is Pamela Jumper Thurman. I'm Western Cherokee from Tahlequah, Oklahoma. And this is?
Hello, this is Barbara Plested, and it's a real honor to be here today with you guys. I hope it's beneficial, and we look forward to you guys using this in your communities and tribes.
What I'd like to do first is to start out with a story. This is a story about turtle and lightning, and we always like to preface any work with community readiness with this story. One day, Turtle and Lightning were walking along the riverbank, and they ran into each other. They were really pleased to see each other because they hadn't visited for a long, long time. And so they sat down, and they talked, and they talked, and they talked. Soon, night began to fall, and it got a little bit chilly, so they decided to build a fire and continue their conversation. Turtle said, "I'll build a fire." And Lightning was a little puzzled because he knew that that's what he did really well. But he said, "It's okay, I'll let Turtle build that fire." So Turtle, has little bitty legs, and he went over and he got a twig and he picked it up and he brought it back. He got another twig, picked that up and brought it back. And he got another twig, but it took him a while. And Lightning, is really impatient. And he was getting more and more impatient. He really wanted to sit down and visit some more. Finally, Lightning couldn't stand it anymore, so he threw a lightning bolt and started the fire. But it scared Turtle so badly that he grabbed a shell and covered himself and dove to the bottom of the river, and that's where he lives to this very day. Now, the reason that we like to tell this story before we go into community readiness is because sometimes we as providers or as prevention specialists are like lightning. We know that that's our skill. We have that ability. We have the resources. But our communities that we work with are like turtle, and they have to be able to do things in their own time with their own resources. And we don't want to frighten them to the bottom of the river. And so that's why we tell this story about Turtle and Lightning. So we want to talk today about mobilizing the community. And the Community Readiness Model was developed at Colorado State University about 1994. It's when we first started to work on it. It has become a life of its own now, and it's been used all around the world. And we're very honored that that has happened. The general purpose of community readiness is to provide a community, a tribe, a village, an organization with the stages of readiness for the development of practical strategies. We know that communities, groups, tribes, they're always ready for something. So it's not really an issue of are you ready or not ready, but an issue of what are you ready to do. The theoretical foundations for community readiness were built from the treatment readiness model by Prochaska, DiClemente, and Norcross, and they developed individual stage processes for treatment for alcohol use. And it's been a very successful model. We also drew from decision-making process by Everett Rogers, and he used a 5-step process to gather group decision-making. And then we pulled from social action, which was Warren, and the stages of group process. What we learned from all of this is that all of these change models were built through stages, and therefore we knew that we needed to make our model based on stages as well. So what is the Community Readiness Model? It's a model to mobilize a community, an organization, a social network, even a neighborhood, toward making some kind of healthy change. It has 9 stages of readiness, and we measure 6 dimensions or aspects of a community, and each dimension is given a stage of readiness. Each readiness stage then has specific interventions that work more effectively for that stage, and we've learned all of this from the different communities that we've worked with. So over the last 20-some-odd years, we've learned a lot about what works at what stage for different communities. The Community Readiness Model then integrates the local resources and the culture, which is very important, into the prevention process. And that increases the potential of sustainability, it increases the engagement of the community, and it really does add to the effectiveness. It keeps us from wasting our time. We know that if you try to implement something in a community when they're not quite ready for it, it usually doesn't go over so well. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has, and we truly believe that. We've been in communities where there have been maybe 2 or 3 participants at a workshop, and the readiness levels were low. And those 2 or 3 people were the right people, and they made all the difference in the world.
And so this is Barb. And so the model has 2 phases to it, the assessment phase, which is really conducting the key respondent interviews, and then the application phase, which is where you take those interviews and the scores from those interviews to actually develop an action plan. And so with the communities that we've worked with, we really encourage them to do both phases. Some communities just do the assessment over time, but to really have the impact of the model, we encourage communities to use both phases. This model is very different. This assessment tool that you're using to conduct those interviews is very different than most kinds of assessments that many of you have probably used within your organization. Because what we are really getting at with this assessment is the community's truth. And the community's truth may not be the reality of what's really happening within that community. So, and I'll give you an example, and you all may have come across this if you've used the model before. But people's perception, let's say, about leadership or about programs in the community, when we ask questions for Dimension A, which relate to what current efforts, activities do you have addressing on, let's say, youth delinquency, youth violence, and the responses to those questions are from across the board from everyone that we've interviewed is that there's only one program that addresses whether prevention or treatment, child or youth delinquency. And we hear that across the board. But then when we go into the community, there's actually 8 service providers at the workshop who are actually funded directly to deal with youth delinquency and violence. But 7 of those were not even mentioned in the interview. So the reality is there's 8, but the perception of the community is that we only have 1. And really what we want to know from this assessment is perception, because we want to know where is the community so that we can get them engaged. And if they are at a lower level of readiness or even of knowledge of what's available, then we need to know that so that we can increase their level of readiness and knowledge about issues. So that's just one example. So we understand it gets community's truth, but that is exactly what we want. As Pam had said earlier, there are 6 dimensions to the model, and they fall in this order. If you've done the interview follows this sequence, also the questions to the interview. And so that first dimension looks at community efforts, and it's really what programs, activities, and policies are in place related to youth delinquency. And then we ask questions about what's the community's knowledge of those efforts? Do they know who they serve? Do they know how to access treatment? Do they know the staff? What do they know about those efforts and policies? And then there's questions about leadership. And for us and for most of the communities that we work with, those can either be appointed or elected leaders within a community or those informal leaders that when we go to a community, there's always the people that really have a lot to say and are seen as leaders, but they're not in an elected position. So really it can encompass both those types of leadership. And then questions about the community climate. So what kind of community do you live in? What's it like? What are the strengths of the community? What are the obstacles or barriers that the community faces? And then the community's knowledge about the issues. So if your issue is youth delinquency, what do people know about that? Do they know local stats? Do they know signs and symptoms or early signs and symptoms of a youth that may be at risk of becoming delinquent or having trouble with behavior? So basically, what's their knowledge of the issue? And then questions related to resources. What is available within the community or tribe? Not just programs and activities, but like people volunteering their time and space available to have activities and volunteer, and the land, the water, all those resources that what we hope and what we do when we do a workshop is use those identified resources in developing and adding those to the action plan of using those resources that currently exist within the community. And then these are the stages. And I'm not going to go through each one, but I'm going to name them, and you can just see, because this is just an overview of the 1 through 9 stages that we have of no awareness, denial, resistance, vague awareness, pre-planning, preparation, initiation, stabilization, confirmation, expansion, and high level of community ownership. And you can see just by the terms used that, there's more awareness, more involvement, things are there's just more intensity with each level. And so each of those dimensions that I just talked about, those 6, gets one of these levels of readiness associated with it when we score the interview. And so we just want to kind of start the journey now on interviewing and scoring. And so this is the process overall that we use and that you will use or have used in conducting your interviews, is to identify that issue. And I'm not sure if you're all going to be using the exact same issue, but I know it's going to relate to youth and delinquency or violence or bullying or whatever that issue, but that you are sure that it's very specific what the issue is and that you only identify one issue per interview. So, for instance, I'll give you an example. We've had communities that have wanted to do this on youth suicide and bullying, and they used both terms in the question. But the responses become so convoluted because, first of all, people get confused because they're answering on 2 different issues, and the responses may differ greatly, and so you can't really score them because you can't distinguish which one they're really answering about. So to be very specific about what is the issue that we really want to have as part of this interview. And then defining your community. So is it the entire tribe? Is it a region of the tribe? Is it an entire community as far as geographic region? Because many, and I don't know everyone that's on the line, but some tribes are very large. And so do you want to break the tribe down by community and do individual readiness interviews within each community so that each community has their own scores? But that is up to you to define what the community is. And then to conduct those key respondent interviews, and talk a little bit more about that later, but to do those interviews and then score those interviews, and we're going to go through that just here in a little bit. And then conducting those workshops to develop strategies or an action plan based on those scores of readiness. And obviously then to implement that plan and to conduct follow-up. So that is the process that is used no matter what topic you're going to be addressing within your community. And this list is endless, but these are just the types of people who we have interviewed in the past 22 years for multiple of issues. But someone from mental health, substance abuse, someone from tribal government, city government, county, health providers, medical providers. We always make sure that there's always a community member at large within the pool of people that we're interviewing, because we want the voice of people that are not being paid or work in the field that the issue is about. People from social services, a youth, and again, if you're going to be, and I know you know this, but if you're going to be interviewing a youth, you have to get written parental consent. For someone under 18, that's usually the norm in most states. law enforcement, juvenile court, elders, spiritual or religious communities, school staff. You know, the list is endless. So you can add to this list depending on your community. And then this is how we select. It's always better to meet if you're the key person on this project. So you pull together people from the community or from your staff and really sit down and from that list that we just went over, and again, you can add more to that list. But we like to get from a community, if we're doing the calls, we send that list and ask them for names of at least 2 people, and sometimes there's 4 or 5 under each category. You know, it really depends on the size of the community. But at least 2 people that represent each of those categories. And then we randomly select. And you can use whatever process you choose, but what we do is very simple. We just put people's names in a pile and select. But before we select the large group, what we do, because we talked about, we always want a community member at large. So in case we get to the 6 or 8 interviewees and we don't have a community member at large, we don't do that. We just, let's say we have 4 community member at large names. We're going to put those just in a pile by themselves, and we're randomly going to select 1 out of that pile. And then we move those aside and we dump the rest of all the names in a pile and start selecting names out of it. Once, let's say our first name that we pick is from law enforcement, then we go through that pile and remove all the other law enforcements and then pick again. So when we're done and we're doing, let's say, 8 interviews, we have a representation across all of, or most of those areas that we identified: elders, spiritual leaders, school personnel, law enforcement, juvenile court, so that we have a good representation of the community. I do want to say that the minimum number of interviews to do is 8. However, you can really do as many as is appropriate for your community. And the reason I say that is in some of the communities that we've worked with, the key contact that has contacted us has said, you know, if we don't interview everyone on our tribal council or on our school board or on our city council, when we go back to present these findings, I think it will be more difficult for them because they're going to say they weren't involved. And so we have done up to 50 interviews per community, and you still get the same level of readiness scores at the end because we've randomly selected just 8 scores multiple times just to make sure. But you know your community well enough to know, are there people that we have to interview so that when we come back with these results, they will find them to be more valid because they were interviewed. But that's left up to you. But at a minimum to do 8 interviews. Okay? We have used 2 methods, and these are the 2 that we recommend that communities use if they're conducting their own interviews. Doing interviews by phone, that's how we have basically done 98% of all of our interviews, and that's really just because it's cost effective, and it's probably the most widely used method besides face-to-face technology. So when we do those calls over the phone, you know, with those names, obviously when you get those names from your community, you have to have a phone number. The other way that we've done them, and this works well in communities that are doing them themselves, is to do face-to-face. You can meet with that person, obviously, in a quiet place that's, you know, kind of a secure place where you're going to be doing those interviews. And that's very appropriate in a lot of communities. And we've had communities that have said, you know, phone interviewing just doesn't work here culturally, and we have gone to that community to do face-to-face interviews. The one way that we don't recommend that you do the interviews is to send the written document with the questions to someone to fill out and write their answers. And the only reason that it doesn't work, and we have found this out by doing it, just to test it, is that people go and find the reality and the real truth of the community because they want their answers to be right. So they may only know about one effort in the community, but when they go to the phone book or to the resource directory, they type in all the responses that are under it. So what you get back is really not their perception but their work and kind of their homework that they did a great job in getting the reality, but that's not what we want when we're doing community readiness. We really want people's perception. If you all are doing the interviewing, or if you're training people on site to do the interviewing, it's really a good idea. You know, there's a community readiness manual that I know that the group will make or has made accessible to you all, is to make sure that they really go through that manual just so they have a really good idea of what the model is about, the purpose of the interview, and that because people do have questions about, not everyone, but every now and then people want to know what is this about, what's this, you know, where do these questions come from, so that they really can answer those questions. And if they don't know the answer, obviously to write that question down and get with you, or you can shoot us an email if they have a question about something that you're not sure, and we definitely will respond. So again, to make sure that they're oriented to that, and it's real important if who's ever doing the interviews that they do a practice run through or a mock interview with someone, whether that's a family member or another coworker, that they go through those questions, ask the questions, type or write down the answers, and go through the whole interview process so that they're very familiar with it before they actually do a real interview. And what happens during that process is there may be questions or the terminology. If the person that's answering the question says it doesn't make sense, or I need more clarity on what you mean by juvenile delinquency, what does that encompass, then you can go back as a group and say, we need to have upfront a definition of what our term means to us so that people are on the same page. And this word doesn't work well in our community, to go ahead and revise that one word, but that when you're ready to start the real calls, that interview is set and ready to go and very appropriate then for your community. Also, to make sure that who's ever doing the interview asks all the questions that are on the interview form, because even a response of I don't know is a good response. So to keep, if they say I don't know, just go to the next one, and that may be I don't know too, but that speaks to where the level of readiness is. And again, make any modifications prior to doing that first call. But if during the process of doing the call there's a problem when you get to the community and there's another term that's not known, then go back again to the group and talk about, do we need to then tweak it one more time to change it for the next set of calls. Okay. And I just wanted to show you all, this is an intro, and this is very important for whatever issue is that the person doing it, they don't have to read this verbatim, but when we have people doing these calls, they introduce themselves, where they're from, how many interviews they're conducting in the community, and then also who is being called in the community. People, not by name, but we're interviewing people from, treatment, mental health, medical, so that they know that it's a wide range of people and they're not the only one that's going to be interviewed. Again, the purpose of that interview, to learn more about the community, and that the outcome is to develop a strategic plan that will be implemented, and then to let them know that it'll take, usually our calls take between a half hour to an hour. Sometimes they're longer than that because people have a lot of response, and that's fine, but it's normally between a half an hour and an hour. And of course, always make sure that they know that it's confidential and that their responses will be will be scored, but their name will never be released to a larger group. Only you and really only the interviewer really needs to know the names and the people that selected the names from the random drawing. And then if you've seen the questions, this is the questions and I just kind of want to show you, they kind of run in sequence in your opinion, and please describe the efforts. And we're going to go over an interview in a little bit, but these are just kind of the first 12 questions of the interview. So the interviewing process, kind of just to recap, is that you go over the process with the interviewers, make sure they conduct that mock interview, that they understand the benefits of the interview to the community, and that they can respond to people during that intro of why are you doing these interviews. Remember to make sure that when you're doing these interviews, sometimes And you may not, well, you may even find it with juvenile delinquency, but with HIV and domestic violence, particularly in our instance, we get comments from people or their perceptions about the issue that's sometimes hard to hear as an interviewee because it's not how we feel about the issue. So, and I'll just give you an instance. When we've done lots of work around HIV, and so we do hear responses from people that, well, you know, it's just, it's their fault, and it's because they're gay, and too bad, and really I don't care. We need to hear those responses because we need to know the perception and the readiness of the community, but we can't respond to those responses. So even though you sometimes want to say, oh, you really don't feel that way, do you? You can't say that because obviously then the interview is over because they're not going to share anymore. So to really make sure that it's this isn't a conversation, it's an interview, and the interviewee should never respond to any kind of comment that the participant makes. And it's really good if you can find someone who is a quick typist and a good interviewer. It's wonderful because you really want to get these down as too close to verbatim as possible. I know that's not possible unless you're recording them, and I do want to say if you're recording, then that is a whole nother level of going through IRB and getting written consent that the person, but you can get them to consent on the phone that they know this is being recorded and get their verbal consent. We don't record just because for us all of us can type quick enough on the phone, but you can also handwrite. So if you have someone that's very good at writing quickly, but as close to verbatim as possible. And to remember, there's no right or wrong answer to any of these questions on the readiness interview. Oh, and to make sure, so when you have that person on the line, because I'm assuming, but maybe not, but if your outcome for these interviews is to actually develop an action plan, is to ask them at the end, would you be willing to attend a workshop where the results will be presented and we will be developing an action plan based on those results? Would you be willing to attend that workshop? If they say yes, then we make sure that we write that down, that this is someone that we want to invite to the next stage of the process. So when those interviews are complete, whether typed or handwritten, we always make sure you remove all identifiers on that interview. So for example, if someone says, Pam Thurman from Mental Health really should be a leader but isn't a good leader in this area, I'm going to remove Pam Thurman's name from that and just put staff of mental health, because it has no impact on the scoring. But what that does is just ensure that just in case that interview gets misplaced somewhere, that someone doesn't pick that up and read it and then tell Pam Thurman that somebody said something about her. So we want to make sure that we remove all identifiers. And then also on the top of each interview, and you can type it or write it, if you do 8 interviews, just number them 1 through 8. So you're going to make 2 sets of all 8 with the same numbers, and you're going to place each in their separate files. So there's going to be 8 interviews in one and 8 in the other. And then you're going to give those to the 2 scorers to score a set of interviews. And we always use 2 scorers in the process because it really cuts down on any kind of error in scoring, and it's always good to have 2 eyes on an interview to go through that process. So the interviewers read each interview by itself, we read the whole thing all the way through, and then we go back and look at each of the dimension answers and score by dimension. And I'm going to walk you through a scoring exercise. It's always good if the scorers did not conduct the interviews. Now, in your community, you may not have the personnel or the staff to actually be able to do that, and that's fine. The one thing, though, to remember if you did do the interviews, it's difficult when you've heard all of the responses to just stay focused on that one interview response. But if that's not possible in your community and the interviewer has to do the scoring, just keep that in mind, that you're just scoring one interview at a time, and don't bring in any other comments that you heard when you did those interviews. It's always really good, too, and again, in small communities, and if you were doing this, it's difficult to not interview family or friends. However, sometimes that's not possible. But if you can, and if you have multiple interviewers and they're, let's say, somebody's aunt is in the pool, then give that to the other interviewer to actually call that person so that a niece isn't calling their aunt. And then we're going to go through, we'll go through that process actually right now. And so I'm going to walk through these questions just for Dimension A with you so that you can kind of get a feel for how to score an interview. So that first question is, in your opinion, using a scale of 1 to 10, how much of a priority is the prevention of youth violence in your community, with 1 being not at all and 10 being a very large concern? And then please explain your rating. So I'm going to give you, I'm going to read your responses that we received on this interview a couple years ago and then score it with you. And so this person said, I would say about a 4. As a community, we are dealing with so many issues that really this doesn't take a priority, and it's kind of swept under the rug. But don't get me wrong, it is a problem. So that's their response for 1. And then for 2, please describe efforts, programs, activities that are in place and available in your community to address youth violence. And this person said, we have a behavioral health department that sees our kids who are in trouble because of violent acts. It's an outpatient service. We also have a school counselor who sees youth who are in trouble at school. And every year during the summer, we have a week-long camp for our kids, and it focuses on healthy behavior and relationships. The next question, how long have these efforts and activities been in place? And then the response is the Behavioral Health Service has been here for at least 16 years and has a school, and as has our school counselor. The youth camp, I believe, just started about 3 years ago. Next question is, who can receive services from these programs or efforts? Well, behavioral health will see anyone from our tribe or other tribes, the youth and old alike. I think the school counselor also not only sees the youth, but they will see their parents if there's an issue. And our youth camp is only for youth 12 to 14. And then what are the strengths of these efforts? Well, they all seem to benefit our youth. They provide a really needed service to our community and to our tribe. What are the weaknesses of these efforts? Some people are concerned with the lack of confidentiality, especially within our behavioral health department. People feel that too many people know what's going on in their lives because of going there. Also, we need more funding for activities for our kids. There's really nothing for them to do on the weekends or in the evenings. What plans are in place to continue these services? None that I know of. How is evaluation data used to develop new efforts? I don't think it does. And then please describe any policies that are in place in your community that address or support the prevention of youth delinquency. I know that the school has a policy about violence on school grounds. And how long have these policies been in place? I know it's been around for at least 7 years because I helped in the writing of the policy. So those are the questions that deal with Dimension A and the responses that we received to those questions. And so what I would do as the interviewer is I pull out, and each dimension has what looks like this, an anchored rating scale. But the difference is that the statements are different depending on the dimension. So for Dimension A, existing efforts within the community, this is the anchored rating scale that you'd want to use for scoring. And the stage, those numbers 1 through 9, that's the stage. So 1 actually is, no awareness stage, denial, pre-planning, preparation. So what I want to do as a scorer is I'm going to start always at 1 and move to 2, 3, and 4. I don't want to start in the middle of this because I want to make sure I stop where I think this interview and what this person had to say. So just to recap really briefly, this person talked about 3 issues, behavioral or 3 efforts: behavioral health, which was outpatient, a school counselor, and a youth camp. The behavioral health and youth camp running for 16 years, the youth camp for 3. Behavioral health sees anyone from the tribe or other tribes from all age ranges. The school will work with youth and their parents. The camp works with 12 to 14-year-olds. They don't, from this person's perspective, they don't use any evaluation data currently to develop new efforts. They don't know of plans to continue efforts. And they do have one policy that the school has about violence on school grounds, and it's been there for 7 years. So just a brief synopsis. So now I'm going to score. And I'm going to look at that statement for 1, which says no awareness of the need for efforts to address this issue. It's not what they said because they talked about programming. So I'm going to move to 2. No efforts addressing this issue. That's not what they said because I heard about issues. Number 3, a few individuals in the community recognize the need to initiate some time of effort, but no motivation to do anything. That's not what they said because they have an effort. 4, some community members have met and have begun a discussion to develop community efforts. Again, I think I can move forward because they said more than that. Number 5, programs, efforts, activities are being planned. I know they have been planned because they're there in the community. 6, efforts, programs, activities have been implemented. Yes, I know that to be true. That's what this person said. But I want to move to the next one to see if I can fit this interview into stabilization, which is 7. Efforts, program, activities have been running for at least 4 years. No specific plans, no specific planning for anything else. Yes, that is what this individual had to say. They have efforts, but they don't have plans to continue the efforts at this point in time. So for this interview, I'm going to give it a 7, but then I'm going to look at 8 just to make sure. Several different programs, activities, policies are in place, covering different age ranges and groups, reaching a wide range of people. New efforts are being developed. Okay, I know it's not that because efforts aren't being developed, but on this interview, they did talk about some policy. They did at least had one policy. Programs have been running for 16 years. So, and this is where it really just comes into, as a score, I'm going to use my judgment and say, they're a little bit more than a 7, but they're not an 8 because they do have policies, and they have been going for 16 years. So as a score, I'm going to give this interview, let's say a 7.5, 7.25. But I do want to say that a 7.0 or a 7.99 is still a 7 within setting strategies. So I'm going to give this a 7.5. And so when I'm done, this is the sheet that we use to document all of our scores. That was interview number 1. Under dimension A, I'm going to just write in there 7.5. Then I'm going to go through each dimension that same way for that interview, and then I'm going to go through all 8 interviews using that same process so that I'll have 2 sheets when I'm done that have all the scores. And then when I'm done, I'm going to meet with, let's say Pam is the other scorer. We're going to meet and we're going to go over every interview. So number 1, and I'm going to say I gave it a 7.5. And Pam, based on just the iterator reliability, is going to say somewhere in the 7. She may say I gave it a 7.25. And I'll say, I thought it was a 0.5 because of this, and she gives her reasoning. We have to come up upon an agreed-upon score. So I may say, okay, I'm good with a 7.25. I guess that does fit better. In that lower set of boxes, that's where we're going to put our combined score. You can only have one score for that interview, and we're going to put a 7.25. We're going to do that for every score on every interview, come up with a kind of a consensus score, and then when we're done, we're going to add up all the A's and divide it by 8, and that's the final level of readiness. Add up all the B's, divide by number of interviews, which is 8, and that's our level of readiness. And do that until we're until we're done. And I do want to say that we've seen some communities in the past then add up those scores and present the overall. So let's say you have 6 dimension scores, then they'll add up all those dimension scores and come up with one overall score, that's okay to keep internally, but we don't want to provide that to the community, and especially at the action planning stage, because we want to make sure that if you want to do strategies around efforts or leadership, that you use the individual dimension scores to develop your strategic plan. And we'll talk more about that. So when we go into the community, this is what we want to present. So for Dimension A, for efforts, this community scored a 6.1. They're at initiation. At B, 4.2, preparation, vague awareness for leadership, vague awareness on climate, denial for knowledge of the issue, and resources at preparation, 5.6. And so what this gives the community then is a really nice diagnostic of where do we start with this issue, where are we at, and it kind of makes it so not such a monster and almost how do we deal with this issue, but you know what, we can deal with youth delinquency by maybe addressing, and we like communities to pick at least 2 dimensions to work with, so it may be that they're going to pick, maybe knowledge of the issue and leadership because those are the lowest, or community climate. So we like to start with 2 so it's not too overwhelming and say, okay, so with knowledge of the issue at 2.8, and then there's strategies that we have in the manual and that we present to the group. These are the types of things that you can do within your community that will raise that level of readiness. So that when we do this is the pre, and then hopefully in a year and a half, 2 years out, or a year, whatever timeline you're on, you can do these interviews again, and hopefully with the majority of our communities, the level of readiness raises within that dimension because they've really focused on knowledge of the issue and working with leadership to get them more involved and more invested in the issue that you're dealing with.
Often we like to compare this to the Community Readiness Diagnostic to the lab tests that we get. We may know that we're not feeling good overall. We're not sure what's wrong. We're tired. We're grumpy. Maybe we've got a little pain, but we just don't know why we feel so bad. So we go to the doctor. We get the lab test done, and we find out that maybe the sugar levels are higher, or our cholesterol is not where it should be, and then we know where to work. We know that we need to watch the diet, change the way that we're eating, eat less sugar, do more exercise, and then we can feel better. And by doing that, then you can do the same with a community. You can look at maybe the leadership is really lagging behind. And in that case, then you want to make efforts that will push that forward.
And I do want to give an example. So for leadership, because this comes up in quite a few communities, that leadership may score low. But when we get to the workshop, there's quite a few not only elected officials there, but key leaders within the community that aren't elected officials. And what we learned from that whole experience is they are very involved in whether the prevention of youth delinquency or HIV prevention or whatever the topic, that they're actually very involved, but the issue is they haven't let the community know that they're involved. And so the community sees them as not caring about this issue or maybe other issues. So what we work with leadership a lot of times is just getting that message out of what are they doing within the community. And so that, that can be just a short blurb within their local newspaper or tribal newspaper, but also just word of mouth. And how do we let the community know what's going on with our leaders so that they have not a better perception, but a more appropriate perception of what our leaders are doing. So it's just one example of, again, that perception of the community versus the reality. And I do want to say when you go into a community, or even if it, even your own community to present these scores, is that you do it in a really good way of setting the groundwork and doing a brief overview of the model so that it's understood, it's people's perceptions and knowledge of the issue, because you want to kind of sidetrack people being upset when they see these scores. especially efforts where there's a lot of people that provide efforts and you go in with a score of 2 because nobody identified anything, but there's lots of service providers, or leaders who are very involved and they score a 2 or a 3. So to set that groundwork of, if these are low, that's okay, that's the perception and where our community is at, but what we want to do is increase these so that the reality of what's really going on in our community is really brought to the forefront and get people more aware and involved in the issue.
In the Community Readiness Manual, which you'll have a link to download, there is a presentation script that's very brief, that gives an overview, and it has slides that you can use as well. And it works very, very effectively when you're presenting the scores. So when you begin to initiate change, then you're actually applying the Community Readiness Model. And that will be something that we'll focus on in a future workshop. So how can the Community Readiness Model be used? It's been used for program evaluation. It's been used for research. It's been used for community-based prevention, and it's been used for organizational analysis. So it's been pretty much tried, tested, and has remained true to form. It's been used in a lot of different venues. For instance, it's been used to look at alcohol use. It's been used for methamphetamine, partner violence, domestic violence, child maltreatment, head injury, environmental trauma, and that was atomic testing that took place in the 50s and has now leached into the water systems and into the earth for different tribes that are in the western part of the United States. And because of that, there were high levels of cancer that were occurring within the tribe. So they used community readiness to get their strategies developed and to move forward. They made quite a difference. It's been used for disaster preparedness, juvenile justice and delinquency prevention, transportation issues. We looked at vehicle miles traveled, and this was related to carpooling and people's readiness to carpool, cultural competency, HIV and AIDS, suicide prevention, environmental and weather conditions. NASA used it in a project in Chicago to look at the readiness of people who lived in high-rise apartments to take care of the elderly during heat waves. It's been used for animal control issues, dogs running loose on a reservation. It's been used for prevention of child trauma and just a variety of other things. Some of the milestones that we want to just share with you is it has been used in over 4,000 communities throughout the United States, and it's been used in about 45 other countries. The manual that you can download on the website is available in Chinese, it's available in Spanish, and it is on CD for people who are visually impaired. It is currently being translated into other languages, and when those are available, we will put them up on the website as well. As I said before, it's been used for research, evaluation, for grassroots efforts. There are over 50 published articles by our staff, and probably about 140 to 150 articles that have been published by other groups. The World Health Organization funded 5 countries to use the Community Readiness Model in the development of national policies for the prevention of child maltreatment. And that was a very successful venture for them. We also received an award from First Nations Behavioral Health Association, recognizing our model as one of the 10 best practices in Native country. And then we've been very honored and pleased to see it used by SAMHSA and by OJJDP and by other funding agencies to prepare grantees to launch their projects. And that's been very effective too. So if you want more information about the Community Readiness Model, then you can contact Barbara at bplusdead@aol.com. You're welcome to visit our website. We have a lot of articles there. We have different resources, of course, the manual. All of our materials are free of charge. And I believe the website has been put up there, but it's ncr.colostate.edu. In our every deliberation, we must consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations. We believe this to be true, and we think that the Community Readiness Model, because of its ability to engage community members and because of increasing the potential of sustainability, truly does that. And I think now we're open for questions.
Hello, can you hear me? This is Courtney.
We can hear you.
Hey. Those mute buttons can be tricky, so I just wanted to make sure that I was on. So at this time, we are going to go to some questions. And so we're asking that you use the chat box, also the questions box. If you have any questions about the community readiness assessment, if you have any specific questions for Pam and Barb, I do want to reiterate that we're very lucky to have them present for us as the creators of the Community Readiness Model. So if you have any specific questions, now is the time. And we have about, we're actually a little bit ahead of schedule, so we have quite a bit of time left to get into some really in-depth questions. So we welcome your questions at this time. April asked, will the PowerPoint be available to the group? And yes. The answer is yes. The PowerPoint will be available. Actually, which brings me to another point. Shortly following this webinar, in the next 24 hours, 48 hours, we will be sending out a thank you email to everybody that's participated today. And within that email, we'll also include the resources, which will include the Community Readiness Model Manual, and I believe that's the resource that will be included in there. We are also in the process, when we finish this webinar, we'll begin the process to archive this webinar. So this webinar will be archived, video archive, and that will be made available once it is complete. So yes, the PowerPoint presentation will be available. Also, for your convenience, I wanted to mention that in the files for download pod, you can also download the Community Readiness Model manual there as well as the agenda that we covered today. But all you do is simply click on that file and it will download. So, okay, it looks like we have some questions and some comments, some chat going on, so that's really great. Thank you very much. In the questions box, Glenna has asked, have any communities ever not wanted to complete a community readiness study in your experience? And how would you handle this concern? Or how would you handle community concerns? And thank you both for a very informative presentation.
That is a great question. And, yes. And the reason that happens, and, Pam and I, it happened about 15, 17 years ago, the first time that came up. And what we realized is that the community level of readiness was really at a 1 or a 2 at all of the dimensions when we talked with the key person that had contacted us, because they didn't even want to be interviewed. And so what we did and what we encouraged the community to do is that there were at least a few people, so the key contacts and staff and some family members and friends were concerned, and it all related around domestic violence. And so, and that's actually, I think that maybe it's not the case study in the manual, but what we encouraged them to do and what they did do was meet as a group and just talk about where do we think this community is at, and, yes, it's a 1 and it's a 2 on all 6 dimensions. So as a group, they developed the action plan using the strategies for 1 and 2 stages of readiness to move the community along because they weren't ready to even answer the question. And so, I think it's a great question because some of you may run into that. So you don't always have to do the questions if you know that we're not going to get a response. The other issue that happened on is around HIV, and it hasn't happened in years now. But when we first started doing interviews and the model around HIV probably 20 years ago, people in the community, when they knew we were doing interviews around HIV, they wanted to know, well, why are you calling me? And do people think I have AIDS? And I'm not answering these questions. And so, again, it was another level. It was a whole indication of readiness. And we had to step back and say, we need to approach this community in a different way. And so that's what we did. Meet as a group for those people that are concerned and ready to address the issue and start at those stages, interventions that are low level of readiness to raise the community. So great question. I hope that answered it.
Great. Thank you very much. Yes, that's very great question. Because I think we do run along to all kinds of challenges when we're trying to, with any activity that we're trying to do when we're trying to work with our communities. And so it's great to hear. So thank you for that. So April asked a question about the Community Readiness Study being completed by March 15th. And we have shared with all of our OJJDP grantees that March 15th is, we want to clarify that it's a target date. And that is a target date that is associated with your special conditions. And it's really a date to kind of keep us on track. And so it's not necessarily a firm or a hard date, but a target date, something that we're shooting for. However, keeping that in mind, we know that this process is probably one of the most critical and crucial processes within your strategic planning. And to do the community engagement and get the community engagement and begin in a place, we do want you to make sure that you take your time and you feel supported and that you have all the resources that you need to complete this. And so although the March 15th is a target date, we're going to keep that in mind. But, if we go over, we go over. However, that's just to kind of keep us on track. So I see we have a couple of OJJDP project managers on the line. Kara, I don't know if you wanted to add anything. Maybe you can type into the questions box. Great, thank you, Kara. So further clarification, those target dates pertain to the 2015 grantees. 2015 grantees only. It looks like we also have another conversation going on over in the chat box. It looks like they are talking about how the Community Readiness Assessment model has been used with other initiatives throughout Indian country. Native Aspirations, which has switched to Native Connections Initiative, through SAMHSA and the Native Connections Initiative. Paulette asks, I wonder if we could cross-reference these communities with our OJJDP grantees as they begin to conduct the community readiness. So that's a great thought. I don't know if we had any offers or action items to follow up with those thoughts, but we certainly welcome all input to that. do we have any other questions that we, now that we have the attention of our presenters?
Courtney, this is Barb. I actually have a question. So are the questions already done for the grantees to complete the interview questions, or are they modifying them locally, and which manual did the questions come out of?
Well, that's a great question. And I think actually the grantees will be modifying questions. And so we're sharing the manual, the most recent manual that you shared with us. That's what we're sharing with the grantees. And
okay, great. And they'll take it right out of the manual.
And they're just now seeing that manual. So if you could tell us a little bit more about that, that would be very helpful, I think.
So the manual really just walks you through the entire process. It's got a little history of the model and really takes you right through selection of interviews, the interview process, scoring, doing a workshop. There's case studies at the end. And so the questions are in the manual that then you can revise, and it'll say this issue or the issue, I think, in that manual. It was just revised pretty recently by Pam and I. And so you would drop in the issue that you're working on. So it should be fairly easy. But again, Pam and I by email can, somebody's struggling with what the issue should be, or how do you drop our issue doesn't make sense in this question. Just let us know, because we can help you revise the question so that it's still that you're still getting what you need from that question, but that your issue fits within it.
Great, thank you. And again, that manual is available in the Files for Download pod. We'll also include that as an attachment, or a link to the manual, rather, with our follow-up email after this webinar completes. Are there any other questions that you could think of, or anticipation? Glenna made a comment that the manual is very helpful and easy to follow. So thank you. Thank you for that. So how many are excited to begin the Community Readiness Model process? And what are some thoughts as you begin to gear up for this portion of your strategic planning? While you're thinking about that and writing in your questions or writing in your comments, Pam and Barb, Glenna asked, how many tribes have utilized the Community Readiness Model that you are aware of?
What we're aware of is over 250 tribes, and for many of those tribes on multiple projects. So, domestic violence, child abuse, HIV, suicide, and that's so 4 times within just one tribe. But that we know of 250. But I'm sure it's higher than that, but that's what we know of.
Oh, wow. Well, that's great. Also, it looks like we have some folks on the line that have had some experience with the Community Readiness Model. And April had mentioned that they have done used the community readiness in their past work, and so it's great that she sees the benefit of it. I'm wondering if April and others on the call that have experience would like to be available to share their thoughts, or to be available for other grantees if you have any questions, or because as a community of practice, I think we all come together with the like mind, learn from one another. So Melinda asked for the contact information for Pam and Barb, so thank you for putting their information up. And their email addresses are right there as well. So if we have a comment, it looks like April has said that the personal interview seems to work better than phone calls. So I know you talked a little bit about that, Pam or Barb, during the presentation, but I don't know if you have anything else that you want to add to that.
Just that when it is done locally, and you don't have to travel for, cost to get to do the interview, it really is the preferred way to do it. It's just that because we were located, are located in Colorado, we just didn't have the finance and the funding to actually travel to the 4,000 communities. But so we did most by phone just to be, for cost reasons. But, face-to-face, obviously, it's always better to, to be in the presence of someone and do them that way. So that's great. I'm glad that people are using that method too.
Pam and Barb, as our grantees are working through this process, working through the manual, can they contact you? Are you available for contact and consultation?
Yes, and they can just contact either one of those two emails that Pam just typed in. Absolutely.
Or go through D.
Or go through D, or you guys, I don't know if you guys want to know who we're working with or how that should, anyway, yeah, just, they certainly can contact us directly or get with Dee that they need TA, and she can forward it on to us.
Great, great. So just so our grantees know, we are working with Pam and Barb to set up a block of time. We don't quite know the format yet, but we will have that figured out very soon and communicate that with you all. But a block of time so that we can have you can have consults. I feel like I'm not saying that right. You have consulting time with Pam and Barb, and more information on that will be coming soon. But but of course, if there's additional consultation and further consult needed, Pam and Barb would be available in other ways as well. So. But I just kind of wanted to put that on the radar of all of our attendees that there will be some short time that we're going to carve out and make available for you all to give direct consultation. So. Okay. So let's see. I know you covered quite a bit in your presentation, but I'm always, in terms of strategic planning and thinking about sustainability and community ownership, and really how those two aspects worked hand in hand. And we heard a lot about how this model supports that. I didn't know if you had any other additional thoughts just to kind of bring us home on that point. I think that would be great if you had any additional thoughts about the community ownership and sustainability.
Whenever the application phase kicks in, that's really where you start to learn more about developing the sustainability, because you are pulling from resources that exist within the community currently, and you're not depending on additional grant funds or other money to come in. You're really pulling from community resources from the people, from the land, from the buildings that are there, just from the spirit of the community. And that always increases the potential for sustainability. And because everybody is kind of working together, it has that automatic networking built into it. And people are helping to develop that strategic plan, and they're seeing successes because the strategies that are being initiated are consistent with readiness levels, and therefore it's pretty much guaranteed that they're going to work better.
Wow.
And I do want to add too, Courtney, that one of the things that we feel is a real benefit of the model and just the process is after that action plan is developed. So what we do is after the workshop, we take all the notes of the action plan and make sure that within 5 days of that workshop, everyone that attended gets a copy of the action plan. So whether that's by mail or email, we make sure they have that, because in 2 weeks from that date, before we leave, we set up a conference call with all the participants, and we set that date so that everybody has it in their calendar, and then we call and do a conference call about the action plan. Here's what we got. Is it right? You know, go over the whole thing with all the participants. And for some of the action plans, some things have already been done. You know, it may be that, you know, they said within a week we're going to meet with so-and-so to get some information. But we go through each of the steps to make sure it's right. And then we do follow-up. You know, most follow-up is done, you know, 3 months, 6 months, or 6 months a year. What we have found is if you wait 3 months to call people about an action plan, and this may not be true in the people that are on the call, but in the communities I've lived in and been involved in action plans, 3 months later, I don't hardly remember the workshop because so many things have happened in between. So we do that call at 2 weeks, and then we do 1 month. So 2 weeks later, we call again, and we set that call up at the 2-week one, and then we go out to 3 months. But if the group wants to do it monthly, we'll do it monthly. So that's and the reason I'm talking about that is the sustainability is kind of built into the fact that we help the community stay on top of this action plan so that at 3 months when we review all the steps and what they were going to do, you know, they may have 50% of that work plan done already. So we highlight everything that's done in red, and if they've added new strategies, we put those in green, and everybody gets a copy of that new updated work plan or action plan so that everybody is on board. And, you know, it just gives people this sense of, wow, we're actually making progress, because a lot of times we don't know that we've actually done really good things because we don't keep, you know, communities don't have the time sometimes to keep track of what they've really done. So we'll cover that more in the next workshop, but that really helps with that sustainability of a project and of a movement.
Another thing that I think is a real benefit is that a lot of times we initiate programs and we do different kinds of strategies, and once we've done those activities, things might have changed in the community, but we really don't know if that change was due to us or due to other things that might have happened in the community. But with the community readiness model, once you set your strategies, they're pretty exact. They're SMART objectives. And when you go back and check and do the follow-up to find out what was done and what was the impact and how that might be changed or modified, you can pretty much directly tie most of that change to your actual efforts. And that's always a good payoff, both in the sense of having accomplished something and in being able to report that back to your funder.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you both for that insight and a little bit of a sneak peek of our next session that's scheduled for March 22nd. Our next Community of Practice will be the third session in this series, and we're going to focus more on the implementation of your plan or developing your plan and utilizing your scores to develop your plan, your action plan, which Pam and Barb just previously mentioned. And so again, we look forward to that and learning more from them. And so they gave us a sneak peek there, and so we thank you for that very much. And so again, I invite all of you grantees, those that are on the line, to be on the lookout for that registration when it comes out. It'll be coming out soon, and we'll make sure that you get that in front of you so that you can register and join us on March 22nd. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to take a few moments as we begin to continue on a few more steps in this journey, this community of practice and these multiple sessions here, for quality improvement, to get a little bit better at what we're doing. You know, I want to say thank you for your presence, your spirits. But before you leave, we wanted to, as we always do,